A very good evening to all present here, and good morning to our distinguished speaker. Greetings to all from Center for Public Policy Research. As the world wrestles with the pandemic, CPPR is committed to bring ideas from experts from various policy domains. This webinar is part of our online series, CPPR webinar series. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker and all present here. Center for Public Policy Research is an independent public policy think tank based out of Kochi since 2004. We work in focus areas of cities and infrastructure, livelihood, education, health, governance, election studies, international relations, defense, and security. This talk is hosted by CPPR Center for Strategic Studies, which deals with areas broadly encompassing international relations, foreign policy, defense, and security. It is our great privilege for the CPPR to have with us Dr. John Alterman. Dr. Alterman is a senior vice president and holds Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy and is director of Middle East program at CSIS Washington. Prior to joining CSIS in 2002, he served as a member of policy planning staff at the policy planning staff at the US Department of State and a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Earlier in his career, Dr. Alterman was a scholar at US Institute of Peace and at Washington Institute for Near East Policy. From 1993 to 1997, Dr. Alterman was award-winning teacher at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in history. A very welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Before we move forward with the discussion proceedings, I request all the participants to mute their system and notify us through the chat box in case you have questions. You can follow this discussion live on CPPR Facebook page and follow the live tweets on hashtag CPPR webinar. I now request Dr. Alterman for his introductory remarks. Sir.
Thank you very much, Gazi, and thank you very much. Good evening to all of our participants. It's a real pleasure for me to talk again to an Indian audience, and the times I've engaged with Indian audiences, both back in the days when we were traveling and also remotely in the days of COVID. It's always been a pleasure, and I appreciate the challenging questions and look forward to some at the end of this presentation. It seems to me that before we can even talk about the Emirati-Israeli Accords, which is what I was asked to talk about, asked to focus the remarks on, it's important to understand the Middle East is really in the middle of three profound and disruptive revolutions. The first of these is that it seems to me that the COVID pandemic has accentuated the fact that the energy transformation from hydrocarbons to other fuels is clearly underway. The world had a glut of oil in the spring. Russia and Saudi Arabia had problems agreeing on how to constrain production, and for a while had a race to produce as much oil as they could. There's still a problem understanding when demand will pick up, and therefore how you control current production, but even how you think about exploration going forward. And all of the major energy companies in the world are preoccupied with this energy transformation, moving away from oil. Some people think gas will be used longer, but the idea that we're moving away from burning oil, we're going to move to electricity, we're going to move more toward storing or creating electricity with renewables, that's clear. And what that means for the Middle East is the Middle East will lose the privileged place it's had in global strategy since World War II. The Middle East became important as the world shifted from coal to oil. As the world shifts away from oil, the Middle East is going to have to deal not only with its diminished strategic importance, but also with the diminished resources it will have. Because while the Middle East will be producing oil for a very, very long time, the amount of oil and what it will get for the oil it produces is going to diminish. That's a really big thing. And I think people could talk about it in very theoretical sense. In the long term, it's happening. What I think the last 9 months have made clear is this energy transition is going to happen within the lifetimes of most people alive in the Middle East today. And that's a big change. And I think the region as a whole is still grappling with that thing. Second big transition, transformation, in some cases revolution, is that it's clear to everybody that the US presence in the Middle East is going down and not up. You could argue the US has been fighting wars in the Middle East for 20 years. You could argue it's been fighting them for 40 years. But what I think is clear, and this is a clear link between the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration, is a solid belief, even more strongly held by the American public than American policy elites, that the US has become over-engaged in the Middle East, that the US has been over-ambitious. The US doesn't have the resources or the capacity to do some of the things it sought to do. And so the US is going to have to rethink its role, rethink its priorities, rethink its goals. And that's going to have a knock-on effect on the region, which over the last 75 years or more has gotten very used to rising American interest in the region. And the world, which after the British withdrew east of Suez in 1970, and for 50 years has counted on the United States to be the preponderant international power. What the region will look like without the US as the preponderant power, how intra-regional conflicts will unfold, how individual countries will relate to others. That's going to be taking place within a shifting context because the US context is going to change. And to my mind, well, President-elect Biden has spent a career in foreign policy, is very comfortable with foreign policy. In this post-COVID world, most of the demands are going to be domestic. They're going to be domestic economic. They're going to be on public health. They're going to be on reestablishing sort of government resilience. I think this is it's going to have to be a principally domestically focused presidency, at least toward the beginning, and that's going to accentuate the fact that the U.S. will I think, in many ways, be more cooperative, but less maybe less demonstrative, less active in many ways on the international stage. And for the Middle East, that's a big deal. The third thing, and in some ways it falls from the other two, is that as the Middle East goes through its energy transformation, as the Middle East goes through the idea the US isn't going to be safeguarding everything, the Middle East also has to urgently create high quality jobs for tens of millions of young people every year. The pattern had always been that people would get government jobs. And this was true not just in oil-rich states, but even in a country like Egypt. One of the ways they tried to encourage people to go to university was in the 50s and 60s. If you went to university, you were guaranteed a government job. It is clear that governments can't afford that anymore. They have to invigorate the private sector. But for many countries in the Middle East, they've fallen into a pattern, and this directly reflects, people coming out of Kerala. You have a low-wage, high-productivity workforce, including many people from Kerala, and a high-wage, low-productivity workforce, which is the national population. And you've kept the economy going because You don't have to pay people from Kerala or Pakistan or the Philippines as much as you have to pay a Saudi or a Kuwaiti. And you can have that work subsidizing the people who are less productive. That doesn't work anymore. It's not going to work. They have to get their workforce in the private sector and economically productive. It's a task of decades. It involves education, it involves training, it involves management, it involves a whole series of things that are suddenly very, very urgent to accomplish. And when Saudi Arabia has tried to be very aggressive on this, it's had mixed success with the Nitaqat program. An Egyptian who worked in Saudi Arabia described the problem to me quite clearly. He was in the hotel business. And he said, look, in the hotel business, if I want to train a Saudi to work here, I have to teach him better English. I have to teach him customer service. I have to teach him the hotel business. I have to teach him his job. Probably takes 2 years between when I recruit somebody and when I can put him in the front lines in the hotel business. Or I can tell him, here, you're a security guard. Here's a chair. Sit over here on the corner of the property. And the instinct has been, you can just create more security guards. You create more jobs that are low wage, low skill jobs that occupy people, that fill the numbers, but don't really address the problem of how do you train up a high quality workforce. I think the Saudi leadership is trying to do this, but there's a problem throughout the region of a sense of entitlement among young people, entitlement for jobs, entitlement for the kinds of jobs they can do, entitlement for the kinds of jobs they won't do, and adjusting expectations is going to be a long process. How you adjust expectations when for generations people have said the government's job isn't to coerce me, it's to protect me, it's to nurture me, I think is going to be a process. So the Middle East is going through 3 really hard things, which are strategic, which are happening right now, which are going to shape the future of the region, which transcend any agreements between the Emiratis and the Israelis or anybody else. And I'm not saying that the agreement between the Israelis and the Emiratis isn't important, but it seems to me it's secondary to these broader societal challenges that the countries are going through. Now, I think the Emiratis are being very strategic in making a deal with the Israelis. I think first it was directed at the United States. They have long had an interest in differentiating themselves from other countries in the Middle East. They have a strategic interest in creating an alignment with Israel against Iran. I think they saw themselves having an intelligence interest, partly for domestic surveillance, that they had been using Israeli technology reportedly, and this would be a way to formalize it. They thought they could get something from the Israelis. Maybe this is an effort to have some influence over the future of Palestinian governance after Mahmoud Abbas, who's now, I think, 86, leaves office. I can see a lot of reasons, but key to it also is the calculation turned out to be absolutely right, that there wouldn't be huge blowback, that what would have been thought unthinkable even 5 years ago for a Gulf country to normalize relations with Israel wasn't unthinkable. There wasn't a huge outcry. There hasn't been violence against Emiratis, either within the Emirates or beyond. There really is a way in which I think the Emirates took the temperature of the region and said, people might not like it, but they'll accept it. And that turned out to be the right call. I think for the Israelis, who have had a huge interest in normalization for many years, and particularly an interest in normalization with the Gulf, this is tremendously valuable, in part strategically, but in many ways emotionally, that Israel feels it's ending its estrangement, and it caps a period of really, really successful diplomacy by Benjamin Netanyahu to take Israel from being a pariah state to having close ties with China and India and Russia and really countries all over the world, and bringing in Gulf states adds to that list. So I think successful Israeli diplomacy, successful Emirati diplomacy, an accurate calculus of what the public would bear, at least it seems now. I don't know how far it will spread and how quickly. The Sudanese seem to feel they made a commercial relationship that hasn't panned out so well, and it's slow. I think the Moroccans were expected to be going on board. I think it's slow. I think the Saudis are likely to be very slow because the Saudis are coming from a different place. Partly their whole brand in the Arab world is about being guardians of Islam. And there are a number of things that would make it very difficult for the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel in the foreseeable future. Certainly, and we saw this last week with Prince Turki al-Faisal at the Manama dialogue. There's also a generational reluctance to normalize ties with Israel that I think King Salman would share. He's in his 80s. Prince Turki, I think, is in his 80s. There's a resistance there. One of the things I find fascinating, more than 20 years ago, I wrote a book on new media in the Arab world, talking a lot about satellite television, and the young leadership in the Arab world now is the generation that grew up watching the second Intifada on Al Jazeera. And at the time, when people were constantly exposed to images of Israelis and Palestinians clashing and wounded Palestinians, there's a sense that this would radicalize Arab populations. And I just think it's interesting, notable, bears exploration, why the generation that grew up watching the Intifada on television feels less of an emotional and moral tie to the Palestinians than the generation above them. So that's just a question going forward. I don't think this strategically changes Iran's relationship to the surrounding countries in the region. My own view is that Iran wakes up every day preoccupied with its relative weakness vis-a-vis its neighbors. It looks for cheap ways to force people to deal with them. They've invested extensively in asymmetrical power. That's why they support the Quds Force. That's why they have all these political parties and proxies throughout the region. As you recall, 18 months ago, when they were putting limpet mines on ships, it's all a little bit deniable, but not really deniable. And it's, I think, an Iranian way of forcing people to deal with them. I think the Iranians' response to the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration was partly to show they're not going to buckle under, partly to show they're not afraid, but partly to show they really want to talk. I think the goal is to be in negotiations. When they're excluded from negotiations, they think their position gets weaker. As soon as they're in negotiations, you can trade things back and forth. They become much more comfortable. So I would expect that the Iranians are going to try to create something of a crisis early in the Biden administration. We've already seen it with their efforts to increase their enrichment. But I think the goal is to force people to negotiate with them because the Iranians feel weakened when they're being ostracized. I don't see the Israeli-Emirati deal changing that equation very much. There may be aspects of the deal I'm not aware of, but it seems to me that the Iranians want to work in this gray zone, and there's not a lot that the Israelis and Emiratis can do that will force them out of the gray zone. Part of the glory of the position they've taken from their perspective is that every time they don't win, every time they don't lose, they count it as a win. So mere survival is a win. I think they have a very low threshold for what success looks like. Um, Overall, I think the Biden administration is going to try to support greater normalization with Israel. At the same time, it's going to push the Israelis to deal more with the Palestinians. And one of the concerns that I've heard from a number of people who I expect to be in or close to a Biden administration uh, is this sense that the Palestinians have been left out of everything. And I certainly was worried when I first heard about the UAE Israel Accords, and I'm still worried that you may have this desperation that arises in the Palestinian community, which will create an impulse to do anything to get attention, to force the world to deal with them. So I would expect that on the one hand, the United States will be trying to ease Israel's way in the region, but part of that will also be trying to push the Israelis to uh, move on issues of Palestinian self-determination. Certainly the danger that is lurking is that if the Israelis are totally focused on normalization and the Arabs they're not fighting with far away, that it would create a problem with Arabs who would decide to fight them, the Palestinians fight them uh, nearby because they feel that they're being ignored. Um, I think that one of the really important things to keep in mind about all of this is the Middle East is in the process of profound transformation. And with the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, with the end of the oil era, uh, with the end of this period of U.S. hegemony, with tremendously uh, increasing employment challenges. This is not the Arab world. This is not the Middle East that we've been used to studying. And we're used to thinking, oh, it's so unstable because of all the wars and everything else. It seems to me that on a social level, on a political level, this is a region that is going to undergo a transformation more profound than anything it's had in the last 75 years. And it's going to be happening in the next 10. The real challenge for us is to understand not only what direction that change is going to go, but how much do we care about it? How much role do we have in shaping it? And how will wherever it turns out affect us and our lives and the lives of our countries in the years ahead? So, Gazi, why don't I leave it there, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Uh, Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for this insightful discussion on Middle East. And the way you said, Middle East is in transition. I agree with that. And because we have been seeing, the rise in humanitarian crisis, refugee problem, wars, we have Syria, we have Yemen, these are the failed states we have. So we have proxy war going on. So there is this struggle between this Saudi Arabia and Iran. So these are the two blocks. It can be sectarian clash. It can be for regional influence. It can be on economy. It can be on who will be leading the oil market in the world. I also agree with this point that the Biden administration will look for again normalizing relations with, because we have seen whenever there is a democratic president in the White House, so we have a little bit of problem with the Israeli government, but overall the relation will be same. But at the same time, yes, definitely Biden will definitely look for an easy way out where he can push for the Iran nuclear deal. Uh, uh, that was all fine on one side. Now coming back to the discussion on this particular Abraham Accord, sir, what do you see? Who are the winners and the losers in this accord? because I have gone through the literature. There are various arguments. This United States and Israel and countries like UAE, Bahrain, they are winners, and at the same time the losers are the Iranian leadership as well as the Palestinians. What is your take on that? Who are the winners and the losers in this accord?
First, let me comment. I mean, you made the I think in many ways accurate comment that the democratic presidents in the Israeli government are often at odds. I think if you take it more broadly, there's sort of two issues there. One is Benjamin Netanyahu has not always gotten along well with democratic presidents. Traditionally, democratic presidents were more favorably disposed toward Israel. Republican presidents were more favorably disposed uh, toward Arab interests, Arab concerns, and Benjamin Netanyahu changed that. But I think there's a sort of a different element as well, which is that Israelis have tended to get along well with presidents who have a high emotional content, and Israelis have tended to get along poorly with presidents who are very sort of academic and clinical. Um, Carter was very academic and clinical. Obama was very academic and clinical. Israelis actually loved Bill Clinton, and Israelis loved George W. Bush. Now, on that spectrum, Joe Biden is a very emotional person. He connects emotionally with people. And so, yes, he's a Democratic president, but he's also a president who I think sees the emotional angle and will speak to the emotional anguish of Israelis. I think it's actually going to be a quite interesting uh, process as President-elect Biden decides, A, how much time and energy is he putting into Arab-Israeli issues, but B, how is he going to reassure, cajole, work with Israelis? I think he will reach out directly to the Israeli public. Benjamin Netanyahu arguably has a difficult political future of himself. I just think it's a variable, and it's a variable worth watching, and something I think we need to be careful not to make assumptions about how this is going to play out. I think it's actually going to be quite interesting. I think you're absolutely. I'm not sure I think you're absolutely right. The Palestinians are losers from the UAE, Bahrain, Israel deal. There's greater impatience with the Palestinian leadership than there's been, and I think some of that's been highlighted. There's a lot of frustration with corruption in the Palestinian leadership. But I think in many ways the Arab Spring convinced governments in the Middle East that their domestic problems were much more important than any of these regional problems. And it convinced populations that their domestic problems are bigger than their regional problems. And so there's a way in which the Palestinian cause has lost some of the salience for a large part of Middle Eastern publics. And in some ways, the possibility of making this peace agreement validates the trend that had been underway for more than 10 years before that people have just sort of moved on. I mean, we can talk more about sort of Mahmoud Abbas and what he was able to do and not able to do as the Palestinian president. I'm not sure the Iranians lose all that much. It's I would guess that a lot of it has to do with things I will never know about the security and intelligence agreements that have been made. I'm not sure that assuming that the Emirates gets F-35s, does that really change Iranian behavior? Because Iran isn't going to send fighter jets up. I think they don't have a lot of targets for bombers to hit. I think the more this becomes about military hardware, the more the Iranians will do things that don't require confrontation over military hardware. So if I were the Iranians, I think I would be worrying more about what the Israelis are able to learn using intelligence capabilities from nearby that they otherwise wouldn't have. I mean, presumably also, you can fly between Iran and the UAE, and I would imagine that there might be Israelis who would take advantage of easier passage to go into Iran that otherwise would have a harder time. But I'm not sure that's been a problem for the Israelis. I mean, there's a lot of Israelis with dual passports and all those kinds of things. I'm not sure what the limitations are, and I'm not sure what the agreement has helped them get over.
Okay, thank you, sir. There is, I have one more concern here. So unless and until, I mean, MBS, or for that matter, the Mohammed bin Salman, whether it was in his goodwill or whatever it is, so maybe he was taken into confidence, then only UAE and Bahrain went and had a, they signed the deal with the Israelis. At the same time, Oman is one of the countries which has been hosting Israelis for a long time now. So do you see in this present context, when we have Egypt, when we have Jordan, when we have now UAE, Bahrain, and Oman being, sympathetic to the Israelis, or, welcoming to Israelis, do you see a possibility that Saudi Arabia joining the coalition, or Saudi Arabia, coming forward and normalizing its relations with Israel? Although we have seen that the King Salman has, against any deal with the Israelis, but with MBS coming to, or he's crown prince, or he may be coming to power anytime soon. But do you see Saudi Arabia also getting to going and joining this particular deal later in the day?
So first, you're right that Oman has been open to Israel. It's also been open to Iran. It's been open to the Houthis. I don't think Oman's openness to Israel is a sign of favoritism for Israel. I think it's a sign of Oman's role, that it sees itself as a place where people of different views can come together. Of course, the JCPOA, the initial direct negotiations that led to the JCPOA, were held in Oman. Jake Sullivan, the incoming U.S. National Security Advisor, took part in them, but they took place in Oman. And the Iranians felt comfortable coming to Oman, and everybody felt you could do it and nobody would know because the government would be cooperative. So I'm not sure that what you see is a pro-Israel view. I think you see a pro-negotiations, pro-mediation view in Iran. I think there are a lot of reasons why this is hard for Saudi Arabia. One, as you mentioned completely correctly, is King Salman really cares about the Palestinian cause. I think is really offended by a whole range of Israeli actions. I have a hard time imagining King Salman agreeing to normalize relations with Israel. Of course, there have been contacts, but that's different from formal relations. Saudi Arabia has a role as the custodian of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina. It has a role as the founder of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. It has hundreds of thousands of conservative clerics who it's nurtured not only over decades, over generations, to have a literalist view of Islam, based on the deal that the Saud family made with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab in 1744 about a certain theological approach. And I just think it's hard to say, well, that's one interpretation and here's another. There are a lot of people who spent 30 or 50 years with a worldview um, of Israel that's very hostile. And I think it's hard to just turn that off. Um, One of the things that Mohammed bin Salman has done quite effectively is demonstrate that that clerical opposition need not be as much of a barrier as people thought. That he's sidelined clerics, he's sidelined the mutawin who were enforcing religious strictures on the public. He's been aggressive against the clerics, but I still think that when it comes to Israel, that it's just different because it is a moral and emotional issue. And I think because of Saudi Arabia's institutional role, because of its role as a custodian of the two holy mosques, and because of the role of so many clerics in Saudi society, I just think Saudi Arabia will be very, very slow on the official level. On the unofficial, letting the Israelis fly over Saudi territory, that's one thing. But recognition feels to me to be something that the Saudis bring a lot of baggage to, and I find it hard to see that happening soon.
Okay, thank you, sir. Just following up with this question itself, many people argue and many analysts have argued that this particular deal is because, you have enemies of my enemy's enemy is my friend. So there is this clash between Saudi and Iranians, right? In order to corner or contain the Iranian influence in the region, is it that this coalition has been formed, or is there a definite intent behind forming this particular alliance where Arabs and Israel will settle their dispute for a time being to counter Iranian threat? And if so, how do you see the Iranian factor playing its role in changing the political architecture in this particular region?
So first, I think it's not just Iran. Israel sees eye to eye with a number of regional states on political Islam and on the Muslim Brotherhood. They see eye to eye on the Western preoccupation with human rights. They see eye to eye on the wisdom of negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program. So I think there are a whole range of commonalities. And they share a certain view that it's a dangerous neighborhood. And they also share a certain view that publics can't be trusted to advance national interests, and that it requires strong leadership to keep things in line. So I think you do have that sort of that sense of commonality. What you actually do about it is harder, given that the Iranians are not a conventional threat. I mean, the Iranian Navy, for example, doesn't even operate inside the Persian Gulf. The Iranian Navy is outside the Gulf. It's the Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy that operates inside the Gulf. And they don't operate like a conventional Navy does. They have fast boats. They do all kinds of mine laying, things like that. So I understand the interest in having an alliance. I just wonder how game-changing it is on the Iranian issue in particular, having it. Look, I think in general, countries are better off talking than not talking. I think we should be talking with the Iranians. I think the Iranians should be talking to the Israelis. I think the Saudis should be talking to the Iranians. I think all those things are good. And Saudi Arabia, has often had an embassy in Iran. And I think that's constructive. But is this the sort of I just don't see it as the master stroke that will change Iranian regional behavior, because Iranian regional behavior is opportunistic. It is asymmetrical. It often relies on a deniability and a difficulty of attribution. They influence political parties. They try to support militias. They do all kinds of things that are not obvious and which are not obviously countered and which are generally affordable. And I think that's partly because oftentimes US policy is trying to create something and Iranian policy is trying to prevent something. And that's a lower threshold. And I think, again, it all comes down to the Iranian sense of their limited power. So I think, first, I think the goal of diplomacy is to get people to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. And I think we need to have diplomacy with Iran, not because there's no role for coercion, but because I don't think there's any coercion that would end Iranian malfeasance in the region. And I think the way to do it is to engage with them, and partly through coercion and partly through attraction, change their behavior. And that's what diplomacy is all about.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Now we open floor for question answers. I request Dr. Dhanraj, Chairman, Center for Public Policy Research, to take questions from audience addressed to Dr. Alterman.
Thank you.
Dhanraj, sir, please.
Dr. Alterman, there is a question from one of our senior fellows, Mr. K.V. Thomas. This is regarding whether the new accord will lead to intensification of salafijihadi radicalization, mainly at the instance of Turkey, Qatar, and Iran, with the involvement of Muslim Brotherhood forces in Palestine and elsewhere.
I think it's too early to tell. It's an important question, and I would have thought that there would have been more response so far than there's been from Salafi circles. I don't think we're out of the woods on that. The Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood are oftentimes not aligned at all. There are governments and movements that sort of bridge them, but I think they're pretty distinct. And the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the region has been on the defensive for some time. It's much weaker than it's been. But to me, the Emiratis made a calculation that people really didn't care as much about Palestine as they used to. And I think in broad strokes, that's true. But the other piece of that is there 5%, 1% that really, really cares. And it's not so much what the broad population thinks, but is there a smaller group whose intensity is deeply worrying? And there might be. I think we're going to have to, I think it's too early to tell. And it's certainly, I think that the question highlights the importance of paying attention to that, because it may well be that there either is a real problem or that you have a spark that grows into a real problem. I think we're not in a position where we can say, okay, nobody cares, so we can all move on.
Okay, The next question is the participant, Mr. Arjun. Arjun asked you about do you expect Egypt and Jordan to play a larger role in the Middle East, considering the fact the role of USA is diminishing, or US, as you said, they're revisiting their role in the region. Do you think Egypt and Jordan will play a major role?
I think Egypt and Jordan really have their hands full. I mean, really have their hands full. Egypt has, well, arguably, it's the only growing economy in the Middle East right now. It's done a lot of that by taking on foreign debt. Egyptian politics are becoming harsher, which I think is a sign that the government is less comfortable. And Egypt has a tremendous problem finding employment for all of its young people. I mean, Egypt adds 1 million people a year, which in an Indian context might not seem like a lot, but in Egyptian context, it is a lot. So I think Egypt for many years led the Arab world. I think Egypt hasn't led the Arab world. And while Egypt has an instinct to lead the Arab world, I look around and I see Egypt not leading the Arab world nearly like it did in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think they're preoccupied with the problems of Egypt, and they have to get their house in order before they can play a regional role. The other thing that's going on is that when the Arab world was really fixated on Palestine and this idea of Arab socialism and republicanism and all those things, that Egypt was obviously a center. I don't think Egypt is relevant to many of the issues that Arab states consider the most pressing issue, or that Arab publics consider the most pressing issue. And that makes it harder for Egypt to play a central role. Gamal Abdel Nasser was unusually charismatic, but he also had issues at play that gave him an opportunity to lead. And I think Egypt has in many ways lost that opportunity. Jordan has profound problems at home, not least this huge refugee population. About 10% of the population of Jordan is Syrian refugees. They're really trying to get the economy moving. COVID has hit them very hard. I think Jordan, and it's a country of only 6 million people or 7 million. I mean, Jordan's not big. I think Jordan is in a very precarious situation and is not in any position to lead the region. It is feeling very squeezed by what's happening with the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's being squeezed by Iraq, which I expect to get bumpier rather than easier in the time to come. It's squeezed by the war in Syria. It is squeezed by an apprehension that the United States and Europe and Gulf states, who have often supported Jordan economically and all kinds of other ways, are going to feel their hands are full and aren't going to be able to support Jordan in the future the way they supported Jordan in the past. And they will have a difficult time. So I don't think you're going to see leadership from there. I think you are going to see the Emiratis try to play a more aggressive role on the regional stage. I think the Saudis have been trying to play.
What about Kuwait?
Kuwait just had parliamentary elections, and Kuwait's in a difficult political place. Kuwait has to figure out what it's going to do economically and politically going forward. One of the consequences, my friend Mike Herb at Georgia State's written a lot about Kuwaiti politics, and the nature of the democratic process in Kuwait is it's created an insistence that the government pay out high benefits to all Kuwaitis. and periodically relieve people's debt that they accumulated because they were spending irresponsibly. Um, and so rather than making investments, Kuwait ends up being very slow and much more on the states more on the distribution side than on the investing side in economic change. Um, the new Emir is a consensus builder. The, the, I think there's not a lot of energy in the leadership to be transformational in Kuwait. You know, one of the interesting things about the Emirates is Mohammed bin Zayed in his 40s became a really young, energetic, visionary leader uh, who changed a lot of things. And his father, Sheikh Zayed, was much more incremental in his approach, and Mohammed bin Zayed has been very aggressive. Mohammed bin Salman is young and has been very aggressive. Kuwait doesn't have a young leadership cadre that has energy and is garnering public support for a more aggressive approach domestically, let alone a more aggressive regional role. And there's a way in which, and I'm sure uh, many folks who've spent time in Kuwait see this as well. The hangover of the Iraqi invasion is still there. The deep Kuwaiti ambivalence about are we really Arab anyway, since the Arabs didn't help us. There's something about the Kuwaiti relationship to the rest of the region, which was scarred by the 1990 invasion, which on top of everything else, I think would prevent Kuwait from trying to be a catalyst for regional change, except as the late Emir did, to try to be a mediator, to try to build consensus. But I don't think they're going to try to make change.
Yeah.
You know, Iraq is going to have a really bumpy time as well. We can talk about that if you're interested.
Sure, sure. Thanks for the detailed explanation, Dr. Alterman. This is the last question from the participant side I choose from. This is about the sale of advanced fighter jets F-35 to the UAE. And now the Israelis are expecting a return, a return from the US and from the Washington. And what degree will this affect, to what degree will this affect the balance of power on ground and the peace processes itself, given the Emirati aerial superiority?
So that is, what did the Israelis get to compensate for the Emiratis getting the F-35, so they still have what's called the qualitative military edge? I have no idea, but I can't imagine that this wasn't sort of completely worked out in advance. The Emiratis have not always, for many years, the Emiratis have sought to increase their weapons capabilities. The Emiratis have always understood that buying American weapons requires Israeli acquiescence. The Emiratis have always been able to get Israeli acquiescence because the Israelis have always gotten something in exchange. And so the Israelis feel like they're getting something and the Emiratis feel they're getting something. I don't know what's on the wish list, but I think the Israelis must have asked for something. And I think the Trump administration must have agreed to something. But I don't question Israel's military superiority anyway, because not only because of what they have, but the skill with which they can operate, which is much, much better than anybody else in the region.
Sure. Thanks, Alterman. Back to Gazi Hassan.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very insightful and very interesting take on the whole what Abraham Accords means for the region and how the geopolitics may change or may not change. As you said, you don't see any significant things happening or changing in Middle East. We will see. I mean, it's still a long time to go. Now that new administration is back in, I mean, in White House, so we seriously don't know what will be the exact strategy or the foreign policy priority for the new administration with respect to Middle East. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Uh, I would like to thank our distinguished speaker for taking time for his from his busy schedule and sharing with us his insight on this very important topic. I hope this very discussion will lead to a larger debate and help in understanding, the politics and the geopolitics in the Middle East. I'm also thankful for all the participants for being here first and uh, you know uh, in and being an engaging audience as well. We hope you keep coming back for our future events of CPPR. To know more about the work we do, please check our website, cppr.in. CPPR is also active on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, LinkedIn. The handle we use is CPPR India. You can catch the live updates of today's webinar on hashtag CPPR webinar. I once again thank all the participants and our distinguished speaker for being here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.